The moment I heard the sharp click of her phone screen, I knew trouble had begun. Red and blue lights flickered across my driveway before I even saw the police car, slicing through the afternoon like a warning. But my pulse didn't race, not out of fear, but anticipation. This wasn't going to be an ordinary neighborhood argument. This was about to spiral into something far more chaotic than anyone expected. Stay with me, because what unfolded next completely flipped the script on who really held the power. It all started with something mundane. I had parked my truck across my driveway while unloading heavy equipment. A routine task I'd done countless times before. Then came her voice, sharp, loud, and filled with a sense of entitlement. She declared that I was blocking access, that I couldn't park there. I explained calmly that it was my property. She laughed, not a friendly laugh, but one dripping with arrogance, as if I didn't matter. Then came the announcement that would ignite everything: she was calling the police. Not asking. Not suggesting. Announcing it like a victory she was already certain she would claim. Her voice carried across the street, and neighbors began to peek through their windows. I stayed quiet, arms crossed, as I often do in situations like this. Years of leadership taught me that silence often speaks louder than protest. Minutes later, the police cruiser pulled into view, the lights bouncing off the pavement, the house, the truck. She strutted forward with the confidence of someone expecting the world to bend to her version of reality. She described me as aggressive, suspicious, even dangerous. I said nothing. I let her paint the picture she wanted, knowing that the truth had its own weight. The officer stepped out, eyes scanning, posture alert. My calm presence contrasted with her frantic energy. She rushed forward, pointing, speaking rapidly, trying to assert her narrative. I stayed still, letting her finish. Then came the shift, the subtle one that would unravel her entire plan. The officer asked for my identification. I handed it over calmly. His eyes dropped to the card, then widened in surprise. Recognition. Respect. Suddenly, the air between us shifted. She noticed it immediately, the first crack in her confidence, the start of panic blooming across her features. Everything she thought she controlled was slipping away. And at that moment, I realized, the true test wasn't about the driveway, the truck, or even her call. It was about authority, perception, and control. And I had it. The moment the officer recognized who I was, the energy of the entire scene shifted. His stance straightened, his voice gained weight, and the casual caution he had brought with him vanished. Even before he spoke, the subtle change in his body language was enough to make her pause. She had assumed she controlled the narrative simply by dialing 911 and yelling. She had no idea the reality she had walked into. The officer asked me to confirm my name and role. I did, calmly, evenly, letting the words land without any need for theatrics. Each syllable carried authority. Her expression changed from smug confidence to visible confusion. For the first time, she realized that the simple act of calling the police had put her in a position she hadn't fully prepared for. She stammered, hesitated, then attempted to regain her composure. But the damage was done. I could see the realization in the officer's eyes as he absorbed the information. His questions to me became more precise, focused, and respectful. He asked about the driveway, the vehicle, and the nature of the complaint. I answered clearly and concisely. No anger. No excuses. Just facts. The calm, unshakable presence I maintained contrasted sharply with her jittery movements, flailing explanations, and repeated attempts to assert control. She tried again to interject, insisting that property rules were on her side, that she had every right to call the police. But the officer raised a hand, signaling her to stop. He addressed the situation with authority, carefully outlining the facts: this was my property, the vehicle was legally parked, and her call, though well-intentioned perhaps, was unnecessary. Her confidence faltered even further. She hadn't expected anyone to challenge her narrative with both fact and authority simultaneously. The moment was electric. Her panic became palpable, small tremors in her hands, a tightening of her jaw, and wide, darting eyes. She tried to speak again, but the officer interrupted gently, asking her to step back and listen. Every word was measured, every gesture calm. I stayed silent, watching the layers of her pretense crumble. She had assumed she was in control, and now she realized she was not only wrong but exposed. It wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about recognizing the difference between assumption and reality, between perceived power and actual authority. Her ego, carefully constructed over months or even years of asserting dominance in minor conflicts, was dissolving before her very eyes. The officer then asked her to explain why she felt threatened. Her words became stammering, contradictory, and desperate. She was trapped by her own assumptions, and I could see the panic intensify. She had overestimated herself, underestimated the situation, and underestimated me. Her attempts to justify herself grew weaker by the second. She stammered, repeating accusations she'd barely thought through, trying to twist the situation in her favor. "You were blocking the driveway. It's dangerous. Suspicious." Her words tumbled out rapidly, but they lacked conviction. Even she knew, deep down, that they were hollow. The officer's calm gaze pierced through the noise, and I could see the panic deepen in her eyes. She had assumed that volume could override facts, but facts have a weight that yelling can never match. I remained silent, a steady presence against the storm of her words. My composure only seemed to amplify her agitation. It's strange how calmness can feel like dominance to someone desperate to control a situation. Each of her accusations bounced off me, and instead of reacting, I let the officer guide the conversation. His questions were precise, almost surgical, forcing her to confront contradictions she had overlooked. Her posture stiffened, her confidence wavered. Then came the moment that truly cracked her composure. The officer asked her to provide her identification. Her hand trembled as she dug through her purse, fumbling with her wallet as if the simple act of producing an ID could somehow redeem her panic. She realized too late that the narrative she had constructed, loud, aggressive, sure, was unraveling before everyone watching. Neighbors, who had begun to gather discreetly, were now clearly observing. Some whispered, others nodded subtly at the unfolding lesson. The officer, maintaining perfect neutrality, explained the seriousness of making false or unnecessary calls. He didn't scold, he didn't raise his voice, he simply outlined the facts and consequences. Her body language shifted from defiance to defensive, then to near despair. The air of superiority she had carried onto the sidewalk evaporated. For the first time, she understood she had underestimated the situation and me. I finally spoke, my tone calm but firm. "This is my property. You had no reason to call the police." The situation could have been resolved calmly. I didn't need to yell or argue. The words landed with the weight of truth, further destabilizing her shaky confidence. The neighbors could see the difference, one person panicking, the other standing unshaken, guided by clarity and authority. Her shoulders slumped as she muttered a hesitant, almost involuntary apology. It was more a reaction to reality than genuine remorse. The officer nodded subtly at me, acknowledgement passing in silence. The situation had been handled perfectly, with minimal escalation. She had learned a hard lesson about assumptions, panic, and overconfidence all in the span of a few minutes. It was clear, this wasn't simply about a driveway dispute. It had become a test of patience, perception, and authority, and I had passed it flawlessly. Even as her apology stumbled out, barely audible over the faint whispers of neighbors, the tension in the air lingered. She was processing the rapid unraveling of her confidence, the reality that the situation had spun completely out of her control. Every accusation she had thrown at me now felt hollow, exposed for what it was, a frantic attempt to dominate without knowledge or authority. The driveway, once a battlefield in her mind, now stood as the silent stage where her assumptions had collided with reality. The officer gave her a final warning about the proper use of emergency services. He emphasized, firmly but politely, that misuse could lead to legal consequences. Her body language betrayed her realization she had assumed that making a phone call automatically granted her power, but she was now confronted with the undeniable truth: authority is grounded in facts, not entitlement. The contrast between her jittery energy and my calm presence could not have been more stark. I remained still, letting the moment settle. Years of leadership and experience had trained me to command without raising my voice, to let patience speak louder than panic. Her attempts to interject, to regain dominance, were cut short by the officer's quiet professionalism. I didn't need to argue. The situation, resolved by truth and composure, had done all the work for me. Neighbors, now clearly watching from behind curtains or across the street, whispered among themselves. Some exchanged knowing nods, others merely observed. The social ripple effect of this encounter was already unfolding. In these small communities, people notice authority, both its presence and its absence. My calm demeanor contrasted with her unraveling confidence, leaving an unspoken lesson visible to everyone present: arrogance without knowledge is fragile. She shifted uncomfortably on her feet, trying to justify her actions, but her voice faltered. I didn't know," she began, but the words lacked conviction. The officer's gaze held hers, steady and unwavering, a reminder that facts were on my side. I could see the realization spread across her face: she had misjudged not just me, but the entire situation. Panic had replaced entitlement, and there was no easy escape. At that moment, it became clear that this encounter was no longer about a driveway or a truck. It was about perception, authority, and the human tendency to overestimate one's influence. She had walked in expecting compliance and had instead encountered quiet, undeniable control. Every gesture I made, every measured word, reinforced her newfound understanding that power is earned, not assumed. As she finally stepped back, defeated, the weight of the lesson settled in. She would remember this moment for a long time, not for humiliation alone, but as a turning point, a confrontation with reality she had neither anticipated nor prepared for. The intensity of the moment didn't fade as she stepped back, shoulders slumped, and her face pale with realization. What had seemed like a simple dispute over a driveway had turned into a full-blown lesson in authority and perception. She had entered the situation assuming control, certain that a phone call to the police would reinforce her position. Instead, every step she took, every word she spat, only highlighted her lack of preparation and understanding. I observed quietly, letting the scene unfold naturally. My truck remained perfectly parked, the driveway orderly, and my equipment untouched. Yet the real victory was intangible. It wasn't in property or possessions, but in demonstrating calm authority and composure under pressure. Years of experience in leadership roles had taught me that presence is far more influential than volume or aggression. Standing still, letting facts and truth dominate the narrative, was the ultimate display of control. The officer, now fully aware of the situation, maintained professional neutrality, yet his body language spoke volumes. Subtle gestures, an approving nod, a careful step back, eyes scanning the woman's expressions amplified the lesson. Authority doesn't need to shout or threaten, it relies on clarity, facts, and presence. The contrast between my calm confidence and her frantic attempts to assert power was evident to anyone watching. Her attempts to explain herself became weaker, stammering phrases that contradicted her initial claims. I just thought," she began, trailing off. Her sense of entitlement had collided head-on with reality, and she was beginning to grasp the gravity of her miscalculation. The realization hit hard: she had overestimated her influence, underestimated the situation, and misjudged the consequences of her actions. Neighbors, now fully engaged as silent observers, reacted subtly. Some whispered to each other, nodding knowingly. Others watched wide-eyed, absorbing the unfolding lesson. It was a quiet demonstration of what happens when assumptions meet authority grounded in knowledge. Unlike her loud accusations, the calm and controlled presence of someone who truly understands the situation speaks far louder than words ever could. The officer gave one final reminder about the proper use of emergency services. Her initial bravado was gone, replaced with visible panic and embarrassment. She had learned, in mere minutes, the consequences of acting without preparation, of relying on noise instead of understanding, of assuming authority without verifying facts. As she slowly retreated, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the truck and me, it became clear that this encounter would stay with her. Not as a simple driveway dispute, but as a moment of humbling realization. One where assumptions met reality and the reality, unshakable and composed, won. Even after she disappeared down the street, the tension of the encounter lingered like a faint hum. The neighborhood had absorbed the drama, subtle whispers echoing from behind curtains and fences. What had seemed like a minor driveway dispute had become a vivid lesson in authority, perception, and human behavior. She had assumed control through volume and urgency, only to discover that knowledge, preparation, and composure held far greater power. I walked slowly around my driveway, surveying the truck and equipment I had been unloading. Everything was in order, untouched, just as I had left it. But the real significance wasn't physical, it was symbolic. The driveway represented more than property lines, it stood for boundaries, respect, and the distinction between assumption and reality. It was proof that calm authority can enforce control far more effectively than confrontation or aggression ever could. The officer remained nearby, finishing his notes and maintaining an alert but relaxed posture. Even in his departure, his actions had underscored the lesson: authority isn't demonstrated through intimidation, but through clarity, presence, and fact. His acknowledgement of my role had shifted the energy entirely, and the contrast between my calm and her earlier panic had left an indelible impression on everyone watching. Reflecting on her reaction, I realized how quickly assumptions can crumble when confronted with truth. She had believed confidence alone would carry her through, but confidence without substance is fragile. Her voice had faltered, gestures had wavered, and the carefully constructed narrative she had relied on disintegrated under observation. Panic, not preparation, had governed her actions, and it had failed spectacularly. I glanced at the neighbors who lingered subtly, whispering, nodding, or simply observing. In small communities, moments like this ripple outward, shaping perceptions long after the initial incident. They had witnessed a fundamental truth: real authority does not demand compliance, it earns respect through knowledge, composure, and the quiet ability to assert control without drama. Her retreating figure was a stark reminder of how fragile misplaced confidence can be. She had believed she could dominate a situation, yet in the span of minutes, she learned that reality operates on different rules. Actions based on assumption are temporary, those rooted in understanding are enduring. The driveway, once a simple stretch of pavement, had become the stage for this lesson. Even as the neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythm, I recognized that this event had offered insights far beyond a simple conflict. It was a study in human behavior, authority, and the subtle power of presence. And for me, it reinforced a truth I had always known: calm, knowledge, and clarity are far stronger than noise, panic, or entitlement. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the driveway, I could sense the lingering impact of the encounter. What had begun as a simple misunderstanding over a parked truck had transformed into a subtle but powerful demonstration of authority and composure. Every detail, the panicked gestures, the frantic voice, the abrupt realization in her eyes had cemented the lesson: assumptions and volume can never outweigh preparation and calm presence. I reflected on her initial confidence, the way she had marched up the sidewalk with certainty, fully convinced that the world would bend to her will. She had expected me to react defensively, perhaps angrily, and assumed that by calling the police, she could assert dominance. Instead, she had been met with quiet authority, measured responses, and undeniable facts. The contrast was stark, almost painfully clear, and it had left her struggling to regain control. The officer had played a crucial role, though subtly. His calm professionalism created the perfect framework for the truth to emerge. He asked questions that revealed inconsistencies, allowed the facts to speak, and gave her no room to manipulate the narrative. His presence reinforced mine: authority doesn't rely on theatrics, it relies on clarity and restraint. By the time the interaction ended, her panic had fully taken hold. Every misjudgment she had made in confidence now stared her in the face, undeniable and unavoidable. Neighbors had begun to reappear, stepping cautiously outside or peeking from behind curtains. Their reactions were quiet but telling: nodding, whispering, exchanging glances. The message was clear: real authority commands respect not through volume or aggression, but through poise, knowledge, and patience. The scene had become an inadvertent lesson in human behavior, one that would ripple through the community long after the confrontation ended. I examined the driveway and the neatly parked truck again, realizing how much symbolism it carried. It wasn't just a physical space, it was a testament to preparation, ownership, and calm execution. Each element: the truck, the tools, my composed stance, contributed to a demonstration of control that required no shouting, no threats, and no confrontation beyond the necessary facts. Her panic, though fleeting in the grand scheme of time, was instructive. She had walked into a situation armed with assumptions and entitlement, only to discover that those qualities could not substitute for preparation, awareness, or respect. Watching her slowly retreat down the street, shoulders slumped and voice diminished, I understood the depth of the lesson she had learned. This moment had become more than a driveway dispute. It was an unmistakable study of perception versus reality, of human behavior when confronted with truth, and of the subtle power of calm authority over chaos and panic. Even as she disappeared around the corner, the echoes of her panic remained in the neighborhood. The street, once filled with tension and whispered curiosity, began to settle into a quieter rhythm, yet the lesson of the encounter lingered. What had initially seemed like a simple driveway dispute had grown into an unmistakable demonstration of authority, control, and the consequences of assumption. I walked slowly toward the truck, surveying the driveway, my equipment, and the surrounding property. Everything was exactly as I had left it: untouched, orderly, but the significance of the scene was no longer in the physical details. The driveway, the truck, and even the neatly trimmed lawn had become symbols of control, patience, and the quiet enforcement of boundaries. This was authority in its most understated form: present, firm, and undeniable. The officer had already started returning to his vehicle, but his brief acknowledgement, a nod, a subtle lift of the eyebrow, spoke volumes. His professional calm had allowed the truth to emerge naturally, highlighting the difference between panicked assumptions and measured authority. She had expected chaos and conflict, but instead, she encountered control, composure, and clarity. The contrast was unmistakable, not just to her, but to anyone observing. I thought about her reaction, how quickly her confidence had crumbled. Her assumptions had been based on volume, intimidation, and entitlement, but each of these qualities was fragile when tested against patience, evidence, and composure. Her panic had been inevitable once she realized the reality she was confronting: a reality where authority is not claimed by shouting, but earned through preparation and knowledge. Even the neighbors, who had been quietly watching, now understood what had happened. Some exchanged subtle nods, others whispered quietly, absorbing the lesson without ever speaking to me directly. Observing from a distance, they could see the power of calm authority contrasted with frantic aggression, a universal truth that extended far beyond a single driveway. I reflected on the broader implications. This encounter wasn't merely about a driveway, a truck, or a phone call. It was about understanding human behavior under pressure, the fragility of assumptions, and the undeniable influence of knowledge backed by confidence. Her panic, though brief, had underscored these truths in real time. Finally, as I stepped back, letting the driveway and property settle around me, I understood the full weight of the day's lesson. Authority is not proven through confrontation or noise, it is demonstrated through calm, clarity, and preparation. And in that quiet, the lesson had been delivered, clearly and effectively, to everyone who had witnessed it. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the driveway, the final pieces of the encounter settled into place. The neighborhood had returned to its usual calm, but the memory of the confrontation lingered not as gossip, but as a subtle reminder of how quickly assumptions can unravel. She had entered the situation brimming with confidence, certain that a phone call and loud words would grant her authority. Instead, she had been met with a calm, measured presence that spoke volumes without raising a voice. I stood near the truck, arms crossed, surveying the driveway. Everything was orderly, as it had always been, yet the symbolic weight of the moment was unmistakable. The vehicle, the neatly arranged equipment, the quiet suburban backdrop, they were all secondary to the real lesson. True authority is earned through knowledge, preparation, and composure, not through panic, aggression, or entitlement. Even the officer, now walking back to his cruiser, gave a small nod of acknowledgement. His professional calm had provided the perfect stage for the truth to emerge. She had assumed he would automatically side with her, that calling the police was her ultimate leverage. Instead, facts, patience, and authority guided the outcome. It was a quiet victory, executed flawlessly and without conflict. I thought back to her expressions, the widening of her eyes, the tremor in her hands, the faltering of her voice. Panic had replaced arrogance almost instantly. Her assumption that confidence alone could control a situation had failed spectacularly. Every gesture she had made, every word she had shouted, now seemed inconsequential in the face of measured authority. Neighbors lingered, curious yet respectful, witnessing the aftermath. Their subtle nods and whispered comments were testimony to the impact of the encounter. They had observed a clear lesson in human behavior: aggression and entitlement are fragile, calm authority and knowledge are enduring. This was more than a driveway dispute, it was a live demonstration of leadership under pressure, a lesson in perception, and a reminder that truth carries weight even when challenged by noise and panic. Her retreating figure, finally disappearing down the street, marked the end of the confrontation but not the lesson. She had learned, abruptly and visibly, that assumptions could fail, panic could expose vulnerability, and authority grounded in knowledge cannot be undermined by theatrics. As evening settled, I realized the significance of the day. It was not the driveway, the truck, or even the police call that mattered, it was the undeniable demonstration of composure, preparation, and quiet power. In that calm, the story was complete, authority was proven, panic had been exposed, and lessons had been silently but firmly delivered.